especially because of COVID pandemic, although less in number, but some of the children with COVID would need mechanical ventilation. So we need to have a fair idea of how to go about ventilating these children. We're going to discuss why do the children need ventilation, the ventilators, their modes and settings. Have an overview of the complication and a little bit about weaning and discontinuation of mechanical ventilation. So this is a case scenario of a 9-year-old child who was admitted with Guillain-Barré syndrome, and you understand that it's a condition where there is progressive ascending paralysis, which sometimes would lead to paralysis of the respiratory muscles as well. So after a few days of admission in ICU, he had to be intubated and ventilated. This is what his chest X-ray was just before mechanical ventilation. Scenario of another 5-year-old child who was admitted with acute severe asthma, remained hypoxic and agitated despite all the medical management that could have been done. Had to be transferred to ICU, where because of very low saturation, drowsiness and exhaustion, he was intubated and was put on mechanical ventilator. His chest X-ray is like this. Another scenario of a 12-year-old child is a known case of chronic kidney disease and was admitted with anuriia and encephalopathy, was found to be comatose, hypertensive and was profoundly cyanosed. His chest X-ray, according to the residents, are really very bad, so they decided to electively intubate and ventilate this child. This is his chest X-ray after the intubation was done. Now looking at these three scenarios, you can well appreciate that all of them ended up on mechanical ventilation. But the question is, why did they need mechanical ventilation? You may answer this in various ways, but the scientific response would be that they required mechanical ventilation because they had respiratory failure. What is respiratory failure? So if the respiratory system is not able to perform its primary function of supplying oxygen and eliminating carbon dioxide so that the metabolic demands are met, so this is a condition of respiratory failure. Biochemically, if the partial pressure of arterial oxygen is less than 60 millimeters of mercury, or the partial pressure of arterial carbon dioxide is more than 50 millimeters of mercury, this is considered as respiratory failure. Traditionally, we have been labeling respiratory failure as type 1 and type 2 respiratory failure. Type 1 is the one where there would be low partial pressure of oxygen, but PCO2 would be normal, or sometimes it would be little low as well. And type 2 respiratory failure would be the one where primarily it's carbon dioxide which would be high, and that would give this diagnosis of type 2 respiratory failure. But in the context of mechanical ventilation, I want you to remember this category of type 1 and type 2 respiratory failure as gas exchange failure and respiratory pump failure. Gas exchange failure, also called hypoxemic respiratory failure, and respiratory pump failure, ventilatory failure. Now this is important for us to understand, not only from their cause and pathogenesis point of view, but also from the ventilatory strategy that you are going to adapt into. So as far as the respiratory system is concerned, you can broadly say that it consists of two parts: a pump which brings the oxygen containing air into the lungs, which then is taken through the number of tubes to the gas exchange apparatus. Now this pump is regulated by automatic rhythm generated at the level of brainstem, and this rhythm is taken through the spinal cord and the nerves to the neuromuscular junctions, supplying the respiratory muscles and the pleura and the diaphragm. And this rhythm generated from the brainstem would cause contraction of respiratory muscles, and as a result of this contraction of respiratory muscles there would be negative intrathoracic pressure, because of which the air would rush from the atmosphere through the airways, upper and the lower airways, to the lungs, and they would reach to the part of the lung, the alveolo-capillary interface, where the gas exchange takes place. So if this respiratory cascade is interrupted at any place, may it be the brainstem or the nerves or the neuromuscular junctions or the rib cage, the chest wall, the respiratory muscles, the pleura, the airways, the larger and the smaller airways, or the alveoli-capillary interface, problem at any layer level may lead to what we call respiratory failure. So just to sum it up, problem at the level of brainstem, the central causes can be infections, cerebral edema, trauma, intracranial hemorrhages, poisoning, intoxications. Problem at the level of the spinal cord transection, poliomyelitis, spinal muscular atrophy. Problem with the nerves and the muscles, the neuropathies, the acquired as well as the congenital. Problem at the level of neuromuscular junction, as in myasthenia gravis, myopathies, congenital myopathies or acquired myopathies, or respiratory muscle fatigue, as in a case of, say, bronchiolitis or pneumonia. Although in those circumstances there will be problem at other levels as well. Chest wall deformities, because if the chest wall is deformed, there won't be enough space for the air to go and to ventilate or aerate the alveolo-capillary interface. And the causes can be as common as severe rickets to congenital malformations like diaphragmatic hernias, or secondary to the chest trauma. Now the problems at the level of the airways, if the airway is obstructed at any level, and if the obstruction is severe enough, may cause gas exchange failure. It can be severe adenotonsillar hypertrophy leading to obstructive sleep apneas, or severe croup, epiglottitis, or a foreign body in the airways, or the problem at the level of smaller airways, bronchiolitis, asthma, aspiration, cystic fibrosis, or problem at the level of alveoli, like in pneumonia or pulmonary edema or near drowning or ARD. Now these causes, the pathogenesis or the mechanisms that will lead to respiratory failure, actually three basic mechanisms. One is hypoventilation, where the amount or the frequency of breaths, the amount of air reaching the alveoli or the number of breaths are not appropriate, or the ventilation perfusion mismatch. So either the air is there but there is no blood to take oxygen from that oxygenated air, so that would be called as increased dead space ventilation. Or there might be blood reaching the alveolo-capillary interface, but it would not be exposed to oxygenated air, where this blood then would be shunted without taking oxygen, the intrapulmonary shunting. And the third mechanism is when the alveolar membrane is thick to cause impaired diffusion of gases across the alveolus. So here you can see a normal looking alveolus, air normally coming in, the blood, the blue blood, the deoxygenated blood coming in contact with the alveolus, getting oxygen, leaving carbon dioxide over there, and the red blood going away from the alveolus. In hypoventilation, what would happen is either the number of breaths would be low or the amount of air reaching the alveoli would be less. Hence, there would be some degree of oxygenation, but you can well appreciate it's not as red as oxygenated as a normal alveolus would be. Ventilation perfusion mismatch. Now there are always areas of alveoli which are not in contact with the capillaries or the blood. These areas are called dead spaces, the anatomical dead spaces. Now if for whatever number of reason this area is increased, the dead space is increased, so there would be air containing oxygen coming to these alveoli, but as there is no blood coming in contact with this, so this would increase the dead space ventilation. The other extreme of ventilation perfusion mismatch is where there is perfusion, the blood is reaching the alveoli, but for whatever number of reasons, say obstruction in the airways or mucus plugging, etc., etc., there is no air to give oxygen to these blood vessels. So this is intrapulmonary shunting. And the last, where the alveolar membrane has become thick, there would be diffusion abnormalities over here. That all these objectives are important. Is located, so we need to understand our machines. In our unit we have at least 3 types of ventilators, and then there are dozens of different types of ventilators, so we need to understand our machines. So I would urge everybody to understand working of their machine. In general, this mechanical ventilation is either given by putting down an endotracheal tube, where we call it an invasive mechanical ventilation, or by putting a tightly fitted face mask or nasal cannula, which we called non-invasive ventilation. Non-invasive ventilation can be positive pressure, negative pressure, but what we are going to talk about is the conventional positive pressure ventilation over here. So just to show you 2 types of non-invasive ventilation, positive pressure and the negative pressure. And the invasive ventilation by putting down a definitive airway, endotracheal tube or tracheostomy tube. So we need to know our machine really. So these are the various keys on the ventilator: FiO2, frequency, PEEP, inspiratory time, the I time, the tidal volume, minute volume, trigger, alarm limits. I know that many of you are aware of these upper 4 things, but I would emphasize that we need to learn about I time, I ratio, tidal volume, trigger and alarm limits as well, please. So FiO2 is the fraction concentration of oxygen in the inspired gases. As you would understand that we breathe in the atmospheric air at an FiO2 of 21%. If we increase the FiO2, this is going to increase the partial pressure of arterial oxygen and the oxygen saturation for that matter. For example, an FiO2 of 45% can also be written as 0.45 depending upon what type of machine you are using. PEEP is the peak inspiratory pressure. This is the pressure given during inspiration. In certain machines it is also called PAP, which means pressure above PEEP. So So a combination of pressure above PEEP, that is PAP, and PEEP is the PIP, peak inspiratory pressure. So this is the driving pressure for during inspiration. If you increase the PIP, that would tend to increase the ventilation, and that would tend to deliver more air that contains oxygen. Hence that would tend to increase the partial pressure of arterial oxygen. And if more air goes in, more air would come out, and as the more air would come out, more carbon dioxide would be eliminated. Hence increasing PIP would help in increasing oxygen and in eliminating carbon dioxide. Now PEEP is positive end expiratory pressure. This is the pressure which remains there during inspiration as well as during expiration. This is sort of a baseline or a constant pressure. This is important because that would prevent atelectasis or collapse of alveoli. It will maintain the functional residual capacity. It would be helpful in oxygenation and redistribution of extravascular lung fluid, and these tend to decrease the work of breathing. So as you increase the PEEP, the surface area of the alveoli that come in contact with the capillaries increases, hence the oxygenation increases. But as the alveoli extend or expand because of increase in PEEP, there are chances that after a certain limit, the dead space within the alveoli would increase. The areas where there would be air, but this air would not come in contact with the capillaries. Now increasing the dead space actually would increase the carbon dioxide at the alveolar level, and because of the equations of carbon dioxide that we are going to discuss in respiratory failure, this increase in partial pressure of carbon dioxide at the alveoli, within the alveoli, would also lead to increase in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the arteries. So increase in PEEP above certain limit would tend to increase PCO2. You very well understand the frequency. Increase the frequency, there would be positive effect on the partial pressure of oxygen and the negative effect on carbon dioxide, and the rate depends upon the age of the patient really. The amount of air going in or coming out of the lungs in one breath is the tidal volume. So generally we tend to ventilate them at a tidal volume of 6 to 8 ml per kilogram. But those who have got diseased lungs, the white-out lungs, the lungs like the X-ray of the chronic kidney disease patient, there you might want to ventilate them on a lower tidal volume, because in giving higher tidal volume may increase the chances of complications, the volume trauma in these patients. So on the ventilator, there is a little thing over there that will give you the tidal volume being delivered to the patient. Remember that there are two types of tidal volumes which are shown on your machine: the inspiratory tidal volume and the expiratory tidal volume. For all practical purposes, it is the expiratory tidal volume which is more important and more reflective of what actually has been reaching the alveoli. So keep an eye on expiratory tidal volume if you want to watch that, which you should actually. And the minute volume is the amount of air which goes in or comes out in 1 minute. So the tidal volume times the respiratory rate would give you the minute volume. Now this is something which is I think very important point. There is the alarm limits. Please pay attention to the alarm limits. You go to ICU and all the ventilators are alarming. God knows what is happening. The alarm limits are for the protection of your child. So it is just like when you start driving a car, and if you don't you fasten your seat belt, it would alarm. You don't let the alarm. You would mute that. And if it is a very important alarm, it won't be muted until and unless you fasten your seat belt. So pay attention to these alarms. These are for the safety of your patients. So there are different types of alarms: the input alarms, the circuit alarms, the output alarms. There is alarm which would tell you if the FiO2 being delivered is right or no, if it is high or low. There is an alarm that would give you knowledge of the pressures, if it is appropriate or is it high or is it low. Same is with the respiratory rate and the tidal volume. And the newer machines, there are alarm for the end tidal CO2 as well. So whenever you put any child on a ventilator, please go to the alarm menu and adjust the alarms according to the age, your requirement, and the condition of the lungs of that child. Please do that. We might talk about just the alarm in a separate talk, but I think this is something very, very important to pay attention to. Now, what makes a machine to give breaths to the child? So the thing that initiate the breath, the event or the mechanism, is called the trigger. That would, in a normal human being, it is the automatic trigger from the brainstem, which is regulated by the chemoreceptors and all the other bits, depending upon the level of arterial oxygen and carbon dioxide. So that is an automatic trigger. But on a mechanical ventilator, the event or mechanism that regulates initiation of breath are of three types. The most important, which is the time trigger. You preset the time. For example, if you keep a respiratory rate of say 20, it would mean that you have put a time trigger of 3 seconds. So after every 3 seconds, in a control mode of ventilation, the machine is going to give a breath. So that is the time trigger, right? Now there are two other types of triggers which are not controlled by you, which are actually controlled by the patient's own effort. One is the pressure trigger and the other is the flow trigger. There are the transducers within the machines which would detect decrease or fall in the pressure intraalveolar intrathoracic pressure as the patient takes his or her own breaths. This negative pressure or fall in the pressure is detected by the transducers in the machine, and depending upon your settings, the machine might give a breath to this child, or might support the breath of the child, or might not do anything depending upon your other ventilatory settings. So this is the pressure trigger. Now the third one is the flow trigger, which again is regulated by the patient's own effort or patient's own breath. So whenever a patient takes a breath, generates negative intrathoracic pressure, there is flow of air. Now this flow of air again is detected by the transducers in the machine, that again would do the same thing as with the pressure triggers. But the important thing here is that the transducers for flow trigger are much more sensitive compared to the pressure triggers. So it's generally said, it's not a hard and fast rule, but generally said for smaller kids, for small neonates, for those who are malnourished, for those whose ventilatory effort is weak, perhaps flow trigger is more appropriate if you want to keep them on trigger. So these are the various types of modes, and again this is one machine. The machines would vary from one to other, so you need to know your machine. So generally speaking, the control modes are the ones where each breath is fully supported by the machine. So the breath is initiated by the machine. One, the initiation or trigger is done by the machine. Two, it is limited by the machine, meaning by how much air and over how much duration air is going to be given is controlled by the machine. So triggered by the machine, limited by the machine. And when does this respiratory cycle finish and a new cycle starts? Cycling, the third thing, is also controlled by the machine. Trigger, limit and cycling is controlled by the machine in control modes. Classically, the classic control modes, patients were not able to breathe in between other than the set control rates. But now we have newer machines where we have this assist control, where we have a minimum set rate, and all breaths which are triggered by the patient above that set rate are also supported. Now the other mode is, which is my favorite mode, is synchronized intermittent mandatory ventilation. Now what does that mean? One, the patient's efforts are efforts and the machine giving breath is synchronized. So machine would not give a breath if the patient is in expiratory phase. So there would be synchronization between the machine and the patient, which is very important here. And the other thing is IMV, the intermittent mandatory ventilation. So all the breaths are not given by the machine. It would give the mandatory breaths in between, which would be synchronized with the patient's spontaneous breaths, and in between these intermittent breaths it would allow the patient to breathe depending upon, and would support depending upon what the settings you have put on the ventilator. So here the patient's effort are not ignored. So this can be used alone, standalone, and or it can be coupled with pressure support. In SMV with pressure support, what happens is that the machine gives intermittent mandatory breaths which are synchronized with the patient's effort. In between, the patient is able to take his or her own breaths, but these spontaneous breaths are supported by a certain pressure depending upon your settings. So we talked about the trigger, the time trigger, the pressure trigger, and the flow trigger. The second thing is, once the breath is triggered, how long the breath is going to go in, how long the inspiratory phase is going to last. This is limited either by the pressure or the volume. So how long it is going to last is cycling, and how much breath is going to be delivered is limited by either the pressure or the volume. So we have got two types of ventilations, pressure limited ventilation and the volume limited ventilation. So the machine triggers in time trigger, the breath initiate, how much the ventilation is going to occur either is limited by the amount of pressure that is reached by the ventilator or the volume of breath that is going in. So the pressure limited, we have a preset pressure which is delivered by the ventilator. Beyond that, whatever happens with the tidal volume, the machine is not going to deliver more. So here the tidal volume would vary depending upon the compliance of the lungs and the resistance of the airways and size of the tube. So this pressure limited ventilation, the changes, tidal volume would change from one breath to other breaths depending upon the reasons that we have talked about. However, because of a specific flow pattern in pressure limited ventilation, the air would have an even distribution in the inspired gas, which is good actually for the lungs in certain ways. In volume limited ventilation, each breath is delivered at a preset tidal volume. You set the tidal volume, say you want to give say 80 ml to a 10 kilogram old child, 8 ml per kilogram. So you have set the tidal volume at a rate of say 20. So one breath after every 3 seconds, a cycle of 3-second time trigger every 3 seconds, and is limited by a tidal volume of say 80 ml. So this much the ventilator will continue giving the inflation pressure till this tidal volume is achieved. So here the pressure, the inspiratory pressure would vary. And this again, if you say you want to give 10 ml per kg, and depending upon the lung compliance and the resistance of the airways, the pressure would actually vary. However, in this sort of ventilation, there would be uneven distribution of inspired gases. One of the reasons among others where you would generally tend to prefer pressure ventilation, not mandatory, but preferably we go for pressure ventilation because of this and many other reasons. So we talked about pressure support mode in combination with SIMV. We can give pressure support mode standalone, where the patient would trigger all the breaths himself. There would be spontaneous efforts, but each effort would be supported by the machine, by the amount of pressure, by the amount of inflation pressure you have set. So if the patient's effort is weak and is not able to generate enough pressure to achieve the required tidal volume, giving pressure support to these spontaneous breaths would be very helpful in achieving the tidal volume. So a mode which is very helpful in those who are spontaneously breathing. You can use standalone combination. Now CPAP is virtually the same as PEEP. CPAP stands for continuous positive airway pressure, which is we use interchangeably to peak and expiratory pressure. It's a continuous level of pressure that is provided both during inspiration and expiration, and it would tend to keep alveoli little distended, hence it would decrease the work of breathing. Just imagine inflating a balloon. If you start inflating a balloon from the beginning, it generally takes little more effort to begin with. Once a little amount of balloon is inflated, then your amount of effort or pressure required to inflate rest of the balloon actually decreases. So the same is with the alveoli. If the alveoli are little inflated because of continuous level of pressure as a baseline, it would be easier for them to be inflated with the peak inspiratory pressure. Hence, it would decrease the work of breathing. The CPAP tend to maintain the functional residual capacity. It will perform little bit same as the vocal cords would do in a non-intubated patient. But when you intubate the child, the vocal cords, the effect of vocal cords is taken away. Hence, they would tend to lose their FRC and tend to have atelectasis of their alveoli if you do not keep CPAP at appropriate level. So the initial settings, in a pressure limited, you want to set the FiO2. You may want to start at a FiO2 of 100 and then come down as quickly as is possible. Remember the side effects of oxygen, so you would not keep them on oxygen for long periods of time. Or you might want to start at an FiO2 of say 40% in those who have got healthy lungs, or at 60% in those who have got diseased lungs, and adjust FiO2 according to what is happening with the blood gases. You want to set the respiratory rate, which would depend upon the age of the patient. This is very important for us to understand. Again, the I time is dependent on two variables: the age of the patient and the disease condition of the lungs. For example, the I time for newborns is generally 0.45, and for those who are adolescent, you might want to start at an I time of maybe 0.9 or 1 second. Similarly, if the lungs are bad enough, because of pneumonia or ARDS or atelectasis, you might want to keep I time a little higher side compared to those who have got healthy lungs. We have talked about PEEP. Generally, you would tend to start PEEP at a level of 4 to 5 centimeters of water, and then you see how things go. But those who have got black lungs, you would tend to keep PEEP at the lower side, and those who have got white lungs on their chest x-rays, you would tend to keep PEEP at a higher side. So the white lungs, as in ARDS or pneumonia or pulmonary edema, suggest atelectasis, and here you would need higher inflation pressure to inflate the alveoli and deliver the gases. But if you keep the baseline pressure, the PEEP, at a higher side, your requirement of distending pressure would decrease, and there would be less chances of what we call barotrauma. So you keep PEEP at a higher side in whiteout lungs. PEEP, depending upon what you want to achieve, generally speaking, you need to have a good chest rise or an appropriate tidal volume, and this is for the pressure limited ventilation. So then we talked about the tidal volume around 6 to 8 ml per kilogram. But for those who have got white lungs, you would tend to keep tidal volume at the lower side because of the protective effect of low tidal volume in diseased lungs. So you would tend to keep a tidal volume of maybe 3 to 5, around 5 ml per kilogram in these cases. So you adjust you just don't keep on increasing PEEP, you just keep an eye on what is happening with your tidal volumes as far as the pressure is concerned. In volume limited ventilation, in addition to the FiO2 and the rate and the I time and the PEEP that we have talked about, the other thing that you want to adjust is the tidal volume. Now here pressure is not in your control. You adjust the tidal volume. You say that this 10 kilogram child with for example severe pneumonia is being ventilated, and you want to give a tidal volume of 5 ml per kg, so you give 5 ml per kg, and depending upon the compliance of the lungs and the resistance of the airway, the pressure, the inflating pressure or the PEEP would vary, not only from time to time but also maybe sometime from one breath to other breaths. So in that case, you would really want to make sure that you have adjusted your pressure alarms appropriately. So this is very important in volume limited ventilation, and in pressure limited ventilation you want to mandatory adjust your tidal volumes, alarms of tidal volumes and alarms of minute volume. So we have talked about the initial settings, the rate depending upon the age, and FiO2 and the PEEP and the I time. The inspiratory expiratory ratio is important, but to begin with it is important, but I will just keep an eye on what is happening with the lungs and the blood gases. Mode entirely depends upon I would say your working environment, the mode with which you are comfortable. I would go for that mode. I would not experiment with different modes, but remember that on volume limited modes you would adjust the tidal volume, and on pressure limited modes you would start with a maybe pressure of 16 to 20. Sometimes I go to ICU and I see that they tell me that the patient is not being ventilated appropriately. You look at the ventilator, they are on pressure mode, but their the inflating pressures are very very low, 10-12 centimeters water. That is not going to do anything. So please maybe start at 16, and then depending upon what the tidal volume is, you might come down or go up depending upon what is happening with the tidal volume. Very high volume have got their own problems, the barotrauma and all. So you adjust the ventilatory settings to maintain the oxygenation and the ventilation. Oxygenation is is maintained by adjusting the mean airway pressure. Mean airway pressure is regulated by PEEP, by PIP, by I time, and to some extent by the respiratory rate as well. So these are the important things. What we generally tend to do is we tend to increase FiO2 to affect the oxygenation. Of course that would increase the oxygenation, but it has got its own hazards and it has got its own limitation. So if you increase FiO2 to 100% and giving say PEEP of only 2 and a PIP of only 10, and the tidal volume is not achieved, you are not going to get what you want to get. So in addition to FiO2, you want to adjust the PEEP, the I time, the PIP and the rate as well to affect the mean airway pressure. For carbon dioxide, the ventilation part is the respiratory rate that plays an important part, but also the tidal volume and the inspiratory and the expiratory ratio. Just don't keep on increasing the respiratory rate to just eliminate the carbon dioxide. Sometimes it may have detrimental effects, especially in cases of say obstructive airway diseases like asthma or bronchiolitis or meconium aspiration, where you perhaps want to adjust the expiratory time. So quickly about the complication. A dislodged tube, a displaced tube, an obstructive tube, a pneumothorax, emphysema, equipment failure. We're going to talk in more detail about the complication in another lecture. Just remember that whenever something goes abruptly wrong to a child on a mechanical ventilation, consider DOPE: dislodged endotracheal tube, displaced endotracheal tube, obstructive endotracheal tube, a pneumothorax, or an equipment failure. When do you wean or discontinue ventilation? It is important because if you extubate them earlier, there are more chances of having complication, and if you don't extubate them at appropriate time and keep them on ventilator, there are the risks associated with the ventilation itself. So you really ventilate them appropriately and wean them as quickly as is possible. You need to make sure that the reason for which the patient was ventilated has either eliminated or has improved quite a bit. There is no major organ dysfunction, and there is appropriate oxygenation and ventilation status, and the patient is able to protect his or her airway. So generally speaking, partial pressure of arterial oxygen of more than 60 at an FiO2 of less than 40 and at a PEEP of less than 5, they need to have an intact ventilatory drive, meaning by the sensorium has to be appropriate, as is the brainstem and the brainstem reflexes. They need to have appropriate respiratory rate, and PCO2 has to be optimal, neither too low nor too high. Neither too low is important, because if it is very very low, it would affect their ventilatory drive. It would obtend their respiratory drive at the brainstem. They would not have the respiratory drive. Respiratory drive is because of CO2, certain degree of CO2 detected by the chemoreceptors, and that would stimulate the brainstem to cause the breathing to occur, and they need to have functional respiratory muscles. We talked about intact air protection, and the other functions are important, as are the electrolytes and the acid-base balance. Nutrition is very very important. Need to have optimized other organ functions. There are various ways of winning. Again, a subject of another lecture at some other point in time. Quickly, quiz questions. The three cases we discussed earlier. Now this child has Guillain-Barré syndrome, required ventilation. Here is his blood gas. And here are the ventilatory settings of this child. The mode, the set rate, the actual rate of the patient, rate at which the patient is breathing, pressure above PEEP, the PEEP, FiO2, IE ratio, pressure support level, and the trigger level. So question is, what is your interpretation of the blood gas, and what ventilatory changes do you suggest to correct these blood gases? The next scenario of a child with acute asthma. Here is his blood gas. So after initial ventilatory settings, blood gas was repeated, and ventilatory settings are over here, and the repeat blood gas is down here. So what setting would you prefer for this child? Third scenario of a chronic kidney disease child who was admitted with encephalopathy and hypertension and went on to ventilator because of understandably pulmonary edema. So we stop here. I would like you to post your, well, we can do two ways. Either you post these results of these scenarios as a quiz, or you post them on the Google Classroom or YouTube, in which case I think there would be healthy discussion amongst all the doctors and the residents. So we'll go for putting your answers on the YouTube, right? So we can have comments as scenario 1, scenario 2, scenario 3, and everybody then can ask questions and clarify his or her concepts. Thank you very much. We stop here.